before.
Did you build the acoustics yourself, or you bought stuff online? Like,
No. So I bought rock wool, big packs of, what do they come in, 6 packs or something, and then just built the frames myself, and covered them in Hessian, and that's kind of it. So it's less, it's just treatment. It's not soundproofing. It was just acoustic treatment, and I put big rugs on the floor, and if people look at if they were to look at the pictures of the studio, you can see them. And then I also got there's a trick from Reed Shippen. He talks about putting books on a bookshelf in your room. So behind my drum kit is a few books, and that was my little like a trial experiment. So I went on eBay and bought a pack of 50 books from a age concern or a charity shop or whatever, wherever they came from. It's like 20 quid for a big box of books. And I just put them on the window to cover the sound of the window and the reflections back from the window. And it worked amazingly. I mean, it's so dense, obviously. So they're tightening the sound up quite a lot.
Yeah, there was a guest on my show, Alex Sterling from New York, and he had his studio was just like covered in books. And I thought it was the vibiest thing. And, the books just reflect really nicely, I think. I feel like it's like a super solid in between. It's not too lively, not too dead. Like, it's kind of like a cool, I don't know.
I agree with you. I think they sound great, and it's quite a cheap way of doing it, and it does look really cool too.
Yeah, books definitely look way cooler than putting a carpet on the wall or something.
Exactly. So I'm going to fill that window up eventually, and so that was one of the biggest things. And then also placement was massive for me. I think I'd had a pretty good grounding in placement from the studio experience I had before, just recording in other studios. So there was a few, you hear about, you see the engineers with the tape measures out, and you kind of pick up a few bits and bobs that you sort of work out what's going on. But there was a bit of a groundbreaking moment for me when I took all of my presets off my template, and I went in the studio and thought, I'm going to start again, and I'm going to do one mic at a time. And I would get the snare mic, and I've got in-ear monitors, and I have a pair of headphones that I put over the top of the in-ear monitors, so it's as close to just hearing my ears as I could possibly get. And I just play around with where the snare mic was angled until I got a sound I was really happy with, and did that with every drum. And it was painstaking, but I'd sort of put the kick mic on, go back and play the kick drum a little bit, move the kick mic, play it again, and just keep doing that. And then maybe recording a little bit and listening back so that I'm not biased by the feeling of me playing the drum. I'm just hearing what's coming through. And I did that. And then I just eventually had this drum sound that I thought was brilliant, and it had no plugins. It was just as a result of placement. And that was a heart racing moment.
That's amazing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Ringo's drum sound. Like, let's get into it, because I know that you've been releasing these kind of like these drum stems to different Beatles songs. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then we could talk about the process of getting those tones.
So that came about. So I call it the Isolated Drums series, I suppose. And that came about because I have a friend in Germany who's a George Harrison impersonator. And he plays in a Beatles show out there in Germany, and he was putting a YouTube channel together where he would play the George Harrison solo. So he emailed me and asked if I would do 15 songs, just the 8 bars or so of the solo. And I thought, well, I'm not one to go halves, so I just thought I'm going to do the whole song, and I'm not just going to roughly do it. I'm going to notate every little detail of what's going on in the song. And that's what I did. So I ended up transcribing on Sibelius all of that stuff. And then I ended up with 15, as close to perfect as I could get, transcriptions and recordings, as close to the sound as I could get of these songs, these 15 songs. And I didn't really know what to do with them. So I thought it would be a fun bit of marketing, but also just fun for people to have if I just send them out. So I put a sponsored post on Instagram saying free Beatles drums, and that was it. It just sort of snowballed from there. And I send them out every Tuesday, and I started doing it fortnightly because I thought I'm going to get bored of this. So I sort of thought if I do it fortnightly, what's 15? It's like 4 months worth or something, or even longer. And it's more than 4 months, like 7 months worth. And then I really quickly realized that people like it, and I've got more transcriptions that I was doing, and it was too fast, so I started doing it weekly. So I'm now on number 46, I think, was the one that went out today.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah,
I relate to that as somebody who puts out a podcast every week. So just one foot in front of the other, and you do the work, and it's labor of love. Right?
Absolutely. I've really enjoyed doing it and learning. It's been a huge, learning Ringo's playing has been huge. And then learning the nuances again of the miking techniques that we'll talk about is really cool too. So it's fun for me. I'm benefiting from it in that I'm learning, and everyone gets to use these songs for whatever they want to use them for,
For sure. So talk about the sound. Let's get into it. What are you doing to get the kind of like Ringo tone? What's the secret?
Well, so it's sort of, for me, it's split into different sections, so different eras. There's the early side of things, which is sort of a more classic British sort of early 60s drum sound. So that would be a monocols, and then so a monocols, which is maybe just above head height when you're sat down on the kit, right in the middle of the kit, and then a kick drum mic, and that's kind of it. And the kick drum mic is at 12 o'clock away from the head, and it's pointing towards the center of the drum. So it's kind of at an angle in front of the kick drum at 12 o'clock, if that makes sense.
I think so.
Yeah. So it's like it's looking down on the center of the kick drum, but from 12 o'clock, about half a foot out, maybe.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, and that kind of gets a real nice sort of warm kick drum tone because it's away from the drum head. You're hearing the drum.
Yeah, there's no click. Right.
No.
Yeah.
And then I will put up. I've got some Reslow RB ones, which are ex-BBC broadcast mics, and I'll put that in the room because a huge part of the early Beatles sound is room spill. So I put those in the room to sort of emulate. It's essentially emulating the vocal mic that John and Paul would have been singing into, to trying to dial in a little bit of that sound. And that's it, just sort of 3 mics for the early sound. And so much of it's in the tuning and the way that it's played.
Right, yeah, I was going to say how the drums actually sound themselves are probably really important.
Yeah, and that's kind of the early stuff.
The towel, right?
Yeah, so that's when you kind of get to the later era stuff. That's when the T-towels come in to play, and it gets a bit more interesting because suddenly they're using a few more mics. Jeff Emerick is engineering these sessions rather than Norman Smith, and Jeff Emmerick's known for being a bit more experimental with the way that he does things.
If anybody who hasn't, I'm just going to stop the podcast for a second. Anybody who hasn't read Jeff Emmerich's book, just like stop the podcast, go read it. It's like my favorite book because it's like recording and the Beatles. It's just what else do you want to read about?
It's the perfect balance,
seriously.
Isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
It's like it's so nerdy, but also so story. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, amazing.
So I don't know if anyone's put T-towels on a kit before, but when you mic up the top head and it's T-toweled, you kind of just get a duh sound, and that's sort of it. It can be a bit thin sounding at times, whereas Jeff Emerick was under miking the toms because no one had really close mic toms before at that time, so he just assumed that underneath that's sort of where the sound's coming from because it's the resonant head. So why would I not?
Right, it's like a kick drum, right?
Yeah. It makes complete sense when you think about it. And then that's where, when you've got the T-towel on the top head, you're getting the attack of the T-towel, the stick hitting the towel, but you're also getting a bit of resonance from the bottom head because that's where the mic's picking up the sound from. And obviously coupled with like a Fairchild compressor, gives you that real thickness of the sound that Ringo's getting on on every T-toweled song, like Come Together or something like that. They do sound really thick and weighty. And I think that it's a lot to do with the undermiking of the toms.
Do you have to flip the polarity on those microphones from like the rest of the mics?
I don't. I check the phase.
But
I don't. It's not something I've thought about really. No, I haven't. But I'm not using over mics and under mics. I just take the cable out the over mic and put it in the under mic.
Got it.
Yeah. So that, and also another, I guess it's the same version of that, is they use a small diaphragm condenser on the bottom snare, and quite far away from the drum towards where the crash cymbal would be, but pointing at the center of pointing at the snare wires. And that again, when you've got T-towel on the snare and you've got a T-toweled sound, it can almost convince you that it's not T-toweled because you're getting so much of the brightness from the snare rattle. But they wouldn't have had they did sometimes, but generally they wouldn't have had a top snare mic. So you're getting the snare mic from a D19 as an overhead, in a similar place to where the Coles would be. So sort of in the center of the kit, just above head height. But then when the snare mic is this small diaphragm condenser underneath, which is really bright sounding. It's just, it's those little details that are the sound. They sound exactly right.
Wow, so cool. Yeah, I was talking to Vance Powell on the podcast, who's like a well-known music producer in Nashville, and he was talking about how he just is obsessed with the actual snares of the snare drums, because like it's called the snare drum for a reason, right? You have snares on the bottom, so the bottom mic is so important for getting like the ring out of the no pun intended for Ringo, but like the ring out of the snare,
Oh, I mean, as an aside, that was a fantastic episode. I listened through to that, and
cheers.
He's an inspiring guy, isn't he? And that was a great conversation to listen to. So if anyone hasn't listened to that, I'd recommend going to listen to that.
Yeah, the guy's a beast. He's an OG. Yeah. So as you were like, I don't know, any other interesting mic techniques?
So the quintessential sounds, I would say that under snare is really important, and then the D19, so AKG D19 was another little seminal moment. So I actually don't own a D19, but once I'd started doing, so I was using a Coles at the beginning, and then I started to send these stems out, and a guy from Wales called Ed Olesko, who is he's a journalist who writes for Guitar Magazine, and he's got an incredible collection of sort of Beatlesy style gear, like Chandler stuff. And he just posted me a microphone. He posted me this AKG D19 and was like, "Man, just use this." I've never spoken to him apart from on Instagram. So he said, "What's your address? I'll send you a D19."
Wow. He just sent it to you for free?
Oh yeah, I mean, so it's long-term loan, and I keep telling him, whenever you want it back, I'll send it back to you.
Oh my gosh!
But he says, I've got 3 of them. You can just keep hold of it for a bit. So I mean,
what is it's a dynamic mic, I'm assuming, right? Like
so it's the 60s equivalent of a 57, and they've got a bit more. I don't know quite how you describe the sound of it. Really, it's a little bit more. I was going to say top end than the 57, but 57s are quite bright too. So it's just got a very unique sound. And as soon as I put it up and soloed it, that was Ringo. It just sounded It just sounded spot on to me. I couldn't believe how much difference the sound of one microphone could make.
That's crazy. Wow.
It's just a really cool sounding microphone. And I was putting it through. I've got a copy of the Red 47 or Red 37 valve pre's. So I was putting it through a valve pre, and again, all of that sort of coupled together just made a lovely sound. Which
you've really got this stuff dialed in. You got the mics, the placement, the preamps, like everything. Are you doing stuff inside the computer also to kind of like, push the sound out in a different way?
So I use the Abbey Road mastering chain that Waves do to so one of the sort of Beatles things that they started to do especially in the later years was just crank the EQs. So they would just have high and low EQs on that red desk. There wasn't any specific EQs. It was just high and low. And it became a normal thing for them to walk in the studio, and John would say to George Martin, just crank the highs and lows, or words to that effect. That was just what they did. It's mental, isn't it?
Yeah, those are different days, eh?
I know. But I kind of like that. I like the simplicity
It's amazing.
of just highs and lows. It's cool.
Yeah, you have to use